Okay. Starting later than I meant to, but we gotta do the thing. Um, why is discount my core legends? Where's my dude ad? There it is. All right. Okay. So, uh, getting started later than I meant to. So let's quickly. All right. Winter War happened. Um, the Finnish were uh far better at winter fighting than the Russians, despite the Russians being famous for their winter fighting. But I mean, come on, it's the Finnish. Have you ever seen the Finnish? For real, like the Finnish are crazy. They're where a lot of the Vikings came from. Um, so yeah, they eventually lost the Winter War though. Um, However, a large number of them fled the country and later came back and reopened the war in June of 1941. So, by the way, they weren't out of the fight for very long. Um, Now, the Germans continued to advance through Europe and take land, but it was largely due to the resources that they required. Um, so they conquered Denmark and Norway, which was due to their need for iron ore. In January 1940, the British, French, and Polish intelligence experts were able to crack the Enigma Code. Excuse me, the Enigma Code. Um, Now, there's a whole story behind that. I mean, we recently had a movie behind that, but we can't get into that right now because I have to finish this chapter. Um, so this was a major break in helping the Allies deciphering the Nazis' coded messages. Now, it was still not just like, oh, well, you ran this thing through the machine and bam, no problem. It was still a pain in the butt. I mean, it was a whole thing. Um, but it did help the Allies figure out what Hitler was going to be up to next. However, um, Germany quickly moved west uh, into Belgium and the Netherlands on May 10th. Um, by May 21st, though, the northern force had reached the sea and had actually supposedly outstripped its supply chain. Talk about that in a moment. Um, yeah, so the advance had left the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, along with a number of French troops cut off from the main French army. The German general ordered a 3-day halt to conserve fuel. Uh, so this was the miracle at Dunkirk, another event that recently received a Hollywood movie. It was a three-word transmission that the forces at Dunkirk sent off. But if not, this was a reference to Daniel 3:17 through 18. Um, Basically, hey, if you guys could save us, but if not, we'll just go down fighting. Um, but since it was transmitted on a wide band, basically everybody in Britain heard it, and they were ready to go. Like fishing trawlers, tugboats, everybody was ready to go in and save these boys. Um, Now, I haven't actually seen Dunkirk, but supposedly that's. Let me go ahead and mute this so that don't happen again. But I assume that's what the movie is about. I would hope that's what the movie is about. The whole, like all of Britain rounds up and does this. Uh, so Churchill organized these ships, as you see here, Navy, private, fishing boats, tugs. Everybody comes in, um, pulls out these 225,000 British and 122,000 Allied troops, known as Operation Dynamo, um, while the German and British air forces were clashing overhead. Now, supposedly, there's some thought that this was something that Hitler allowed because he wanted Britain to remain. He wanted to remain in Britain's good graces to an extent, because he didn't want to crush Britain. He wanted to, have some, if not alliance, at least good standing with them because of his whole uh, Aryan thing. Whether or not that's true, we can never truly know. But anyway, that's another thing. Anyway, France finally surrendered on June 18th. The government did. There was a government exile set up in northern Africa, with Vichy France set up in northern France under Philippe Pétain. This was a puppet government through Germany. So it was use my words right. It was made to look like Germany wasn't occupying France, but it really was. They're like, oh, well, we're just setting up a new government here, and it's just a government that they're running. While the government that was still fighting uh, Germany went down to I already lost the name of where the here we go. Oh nope, it's not there. Um, where the Algeria. There we go. Um, yeah, where France had been in Africa. I guess they had enough of a hold there. Anyway, yeah, I got to keep going. Um, so there's Operation Dynamo. I mean, literally, rowboats and tugboats and just absolutely every little bit of thing that they could do to get the hell out. Okay. Ba, 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 ba. Ah, yes, the Blitz. I wrote a lot about this in my time in school. Um, Europe was either under Nazi control or sympathetic to the Nazi cause. That's to say, Spain. Spain wasn't under Nazi control, but since the Nazis had essentially helped the administration that was in Spain come to power, they were totally cool with whatever Germany was doing. Um, Britain was pretty much by itself. Now, that said, Hitler knew that there was no real way to try to invade Britain by sea because you don't do that. You can't. Um, so he used his air force, the Luftwaffe, to try to bomb the British into submission. So beginning in August, they began hitting military and then eventually civilian targets almost every day. That by the 25th of August, the RAF was up and running. That's the Royal Air Force. For those of you unaware, the RAF is one of my favorite military forces in history. Like literally right up there with, say, the Spartans. The RAF is great. They're this small group of tight knit dudes that are just like, well, time to get up every day and go fight forces that far outnumber us, but we got to do our thing. Um, But thanks to the Enigma machine, they had some idea of where the Luftwaffe was going to hit, and eventually radar uh, was developed, and they were able to use that to get to where they needed to be. Um, by October, though, he gave up on an invasion, but still was using bombers. Eventually, the V-1 flying bombs, these buzz bombs, and then V-2 rockets to hit British cities. Buzz bombs are weird little things. They're not like the rockets, the V-2 rockets. They are like bombs with little wings on them and like propellers. That's what they're called, buzz bombs, that have like a gyroscope on them, and they're just set to. They don't obviously don't use a GPS because we didn't have satellites back then, but they had a really simplistic targeting system of go this far and then drop, and it was enough to go over the English Channel and hit where they needed to hit. Um, they could be shot down, but it was kind of a pain. Um, the V-2 rockets, though, there wasn't much to do against that because they tended to be supersonic. Also, the V-2 rockets, that's what we sent our boys up to the moon in on the top of. After we beat the Nazis, we just stole a bunch of their crap, and that's how we made NASA. So the Blitz occurred from August 1940 to May 1941. Were known as Churchill's in Britain's finest hour because they stuck through it. Um, I mean, it was nightmarish, uh, but they managed to hold through. I don't have a pitch. I don't have this particular picture, but the current queen, Queen Elizabeth II, she drove an ambulance during all of this. Um, and I've got a bunch of pictures of these guys. Franklin Roosevelt was using a Lend-Lease program um, to keep the British supplied. My cat's on the counter. Okay, so there is the Spitfire, a really great airplane. Again, I literally wrote a paper on just this plane. Here's London after quite a bit of bombing. St. Paul's Cathedral. Hitler did order that that be left alone, so it was never actually hit with bombs. But there it is, surrounded by the smoke of fires. Who dares? I don't care. Today is so and so's birthday. I don't care. Yes. Makeshift bomb shelter, which is to say the tube. A lot of London citizens just had to go down and sleep in the subway. And then once the bombing was over, they went back up on the street and, acted as if everything was normal. I mean, it was still. I mean, this used to be their house. They're sitting in front of. Um, so I mean, it's not like everything was hunky dory, but they got through it. I like this picture. I later found out it was staged. It's all propaganda, but I still really like it. Couples were still getting married in front of like the ruins of churches and stuff. Anyway, while Hitler was just absolutely, doing his thing, um, Mussolini's like, well, I guess I can, not have any issues either. Uh, so he tried to invade Egypt and Syria in the fall of 1940, um, while Hitler was planning to hit the USSR. However, Italian army, not really a thing, and they were forced to retreat by some British troops that were in Egypt, um, and the Greek resistance in, well, Greece, decimated the Italian forces that were there. So Hitler had to divert his forces to pull Mussolini out of the fire. Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, um, kept things tied up in northern Africa and eventually in Egypt by 1942. Rommel was one of Hitler's most famous generals. He got quite a lot done. Yeah, there's old Rommel. And check out that tank compared to what we had in World War One. I mean, at the very least, that's some proper armor plating. Now, obviously, to get down to Greece to help out, the German forces needed to go to the Balkans. I mean, unless you're going to airdrop everybody. Uh, Bulgaria and Yugoslavia were more than happy to join the Axis powers. There was a coup in Yugoslavia uh, to try to turn the tables. Yugoslavia tried to switch sides. Um, well, this got bloody really fast, and Yugoslavia and Greece were quickly occupied. Now, I imagine this goes into a little more detail. Yeah, ethnic civil war. Um, yeah, it was just this awful civil war, and it ended up being an absolute ooh, yeah, an ethnic civil war. People being killed, carving letters in each other's bodies. That sort of thing. Starvation was rampant in Greece, in particular Athens. Hitler and Mussolini not bothering to feed the citizens, um, as they left without food after the invasion. Oh, yeah, there we go. Yugoslavia. Um, Serbs and the Croats couldn't cooperate, and the Nazis supported the fascist Croatian group, the Ustasha. Okay, so I did actually get more into that. I just got ahead of myself. Um, However, within Yugoslavia, there's lots going on in Yugoslavia. There was a Serbian nationalist group and a communist resistance led by Josip Broz, who was known as Tito, who fought against the Ustasha. By 1945, though, Tito liberated Yugoslavia. That's actually important for later. Yeah, this is actually in Athens. There is Tito. Over to Japan. Um, so Hitler, of course, was pretty much in control of Europe. Japan was spreading over the Pacific. They taken Manchuria. They took Nanking, killing several hundred thousand civilians. Um, so the Chinese nationalists and communists had to ally. This again is worth an entire course, essentially. I remember doing this back in back when I was in class. Um, they began taking European colonies. By the summer of 1940, they took Indochina. And then, of course, December 7th, 1941, they hit Pearl Harbor, attempting to uh, wipe out American naval assets before the U.S. got into the war due to their own dwindling oil supplies. And it really wasn't until the Battle of Midway in June of that next year that the tide of Japanese expansion was beginning to turn around. However, since the American push during this war was Europe first, the colonial populations were really on their own for much of the war. Yeah, Nanking. There's again lots to be said. Not a lot of time, and it's pretty brutal. And then there, of course, is Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway. All right, Operation Barbarossa. Um, June 22nd, 1941, 129 years and a day after Napoleon's invasion of Russia, Hitler sent an army of 3.2 million soldiers across the border in a line stretching nearly 600 miles. Meanwhile, the Soviets lost 1,800 planes in the air, while the Luftwaffe lost only 35. I believe that was a pretty crushing blow on. I didn't know the Soviets had an air force. Um, Stalin was not prepared for this news. Uh, he spent days in kind of a days. Wow, that didn't that doesn't come out verbally quite as well. Um, so other Soviet officials had to pick up the slack. They moved munitions and industrial factories east behind the Ural Mountains. They disassembled and moved entire factories across these mountains, which was only really possible because the government controlled the factories. Um, Leningrad was besieged for 872 days, which is like, good God, 2.5 years? Something like that. Um, Stalin called on all citizens to resist the invaders, which, is a good way to get a lot of citizens killed, which we'll see towards the end of this chapter quite how many Soviet civilian casualties died. And by August of 1941, there were special commandos who went in with the Wehrmacht. The Eichtergruppen were sent to kill those that were not soldiers, Jewish women and children, because there were a lot of those still in Russia. So here we have lots of artillery being brought in. And there's the invasion corridor. There were a few pockets of Russian military that just got completely surrounded because the Blitzkrieg moved in so fast. So, this invasion would, of course, require a lot of food and resources. In 1941, a hunger plan was crafted. they simply suggested that 30 million Soviets would have to starve so that they could feed the German troops. Yeah, sure. Here we go. Um, Hitler publicly declared the Geneva Conventions did not apply to the Russians. 3.3 million Russian prisoners were captured before 1941. 600,000 were labeled as Bolsheviks and shot. Um, the rest starved, froze, or worked to death. And by January of 42, 2.25 million were dead. So not not how you're supposed to treat prisoners. But again, he just was like, this doesn't apply. So by the winter of 41, the German troops went south to Stalingrad. Um, and this was the meat grinder of the war. Both sides poured lots and lots of troops into the city, even as the city became little more than rubble. And this was the year we had the final solution because as Russia was losing land, Germany was gaining uh, Jews, and well, you know how that is for Hitler. So here's, I mean, this doesn't even look real. It looks like a model of Stalingrad. So, the Jews have been pushed out of their homes, forced into ghettos, starved, or shot by the SS. As I said, the invasion of Russia um, put several million more Jews into Hitler's regime. Um, and as I had mentioned, this was the point that the extermination of the Jewish race, later known as the Holocaust, truly began. Let me blow my nose real quick. Okay. So, around the time we had Operation Barbarossa, the T4 program was discontinued in Germany. Um, so, they shifted the men in charge of that program to work in the death camps, um, which began in October, most infamous being Auschwitz, which was built in Poland. By the end of the war, 6 million Jews died at the hands of the Nazis, although Hitler's goal was, of course, the complete and total genocide of the Jews. Now, we talk about uh, the Jews' extermination, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but they were not the only target of Hitler. Let me see if I've got. Um, he targeted basically anyone that wasn't. I don't have a list here. That wasn't what he considered, you know, part of his master plan. There's Auschwitz. There's after the liberation of one of these camps, the bodies that were just found there. So you know, gypsies were, or I mean, still are well, it's a bit of a slur now. Um, they're like a Romanian nomadic group, um, and they were often part of this. Um, you know, homosexuals. They were just as in danger. Um, anybody that any Slavs were thrown in as well. This is one of the memorials because the shoes tended to survive longer than the other articles of clothing. Um, so a lot of the memorials of the Holocaust are the shoes of the victims, um, and it's pretty difficult to deal with. So the propaganda, of course, there were lots of propaganda apparatuses besides the Soviet Union. I mean, the Soviet Union had its own propaganda. Hitler and Goebbels, of course, convincing the listeners of the Jewish enemy. There were fireside chats from Roosevelt and Churchill. Um, the BBC expanded across the British Empire and into neutral nations, um, offering a mostly objective view. Like I said, I've used a lot of the BBC for my papers. The Allies also had Edward Murrow, this American reporter who lived in London during the Blitz, and report during the attacks. Edward Murrow was pretty cool. Um, he had it talks about resistance and slave labor and all this stuff, and I mean it's just depressing, so I skipped that. Um, yeah, here we go. Uh, He reported from rooftops so his microphones could record the sounds of bombs and aircraft fire. Praised the black-faced men with bloodshot eyes who were fighting fires. The girls who cradled the steering wheel of a heavy ambulance in their arms. Policemen who stand guard over the unexploded bomb down at St. Paul's tonight. He reporting so effectively tugged at the American heartstrings that a leading media critic wrote of him. You burned the city of London in our houses. You laid the dead of London at our doors, and we knew the dead were our dead. All men's dead. Um, so his reporting very closely tied what was going on in London to uh, the common man in the United States. Oops. And then, of course, there was lots of newsreels to entertain and indoctrinate the civilians and soldiers. Walt Disney got in on this. There's a lot of Disney military um, animation things. You should look into that as well. There's Murrow. Running out of time, so I'm going to speed up. Da, 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 da. Now, of course, with the amoral nature of the concentration camps, there were certain scientists like Dr. Josef Mengele. Yeah. Used the prison population as lab rats, or as he called them, rabbits. He was a monster. Um, I won't really even go too much into that. Just basically living human subjects. It's awful stuff. Also, atomic power was discovered in 1938. By 1941, the Manhattan Project was being put together using a lot of scientists exiled from Europe by Germany. Los Alamos, New Mexico was the one that created the proper atomic bomb. There was lots of other labs. Again, not a lot of time to get into it. They never were able to use the bomb on the Nazis, but they did use them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, on August 6th and 9th, killing 70,000 and 40,000 people immediately, leaving thousands more to die from wounds or radiation. Again, lots to talk about there, no time. There was also a technique to mass produce penicillin that came about during the war. So, some good stuff. I know it. Don't get on my computer, please. If you want to get up here, get up here. Toru's back there asleep. There's Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, February 1943, soldiers reduced cannibalism. Um, Soviets were finally victorious in Stalingrad. 90,000 German soldiers taken prisoner. The Axis had lost 800,000 soldiers overall, and the Soviets had lost 1.1 million. Following Stalingrad, production centers in Russia were back in full swing. They outproduced the Germans 3-1 in small arms and 4-1 in tanks, which is really impressive considering what Germany was capable of. So in June of 1943, there was this massive battle outside at Kursk in central Russia. This was a huge tank battle. I want to say the biggest and last proper tank battle in history. Because most of the time one side really has tanks, the other side is ill-equipped. Yeah, 770,000 Germans hit the Soviets, but the Soviets were able to muster 1.3 million troops. The Germans lost 50,000 men and were pushed back. Now, the Germans were forced to retreat, but they retreated slowly. This was still a meat grinder, and 84% of German losses came from the Eastern Front. So, again, I say a lot that Russia was why Germany lost this war. I mean, if 84% of German losses came from the Eastern Front, I mean, you can't really argue, oh, I mean, it was American grit. It's like, but was it really? What if they had 84% more troops? So there again, the Stalingrad. There's Kursk. Lots of tanks. And lots of dudes not on tanks. I would hate to not be on tanks with all those tanks out there. For many reasons. There's what's left of a tank. This is actually a very famous image here. So, Rommel was keeping things secure in northern Africa. By late 1942, the British General Bernard Montgomery was making headway. By late June of 43, the British and American forces were pushing Germans and Italians out of Africa. They were able to successfully invade Italy, but it stalled in the mountainous terrain of the north. They were able to kick out Il Duce, and he was in prison, but the Axis powers were able to get him out and set him up in northern Italy. So, a little back and forth for Mussolini. However, the Allies did finally get onto the continent proper in France, mounting the largest amphibious invasion in history, known as DDay. They liberated Paris by August 25th. In December of 1944, though, the Germans hit the Allies at the Battle of the Bulge, which was a massive counteroffensive by the Germans, and it delayed the invasion of the German territory into March of 1945. So there's D-Day. Now, whenever we see any kind of media about D-Day, it's always one of the, because there were I want to say 8 different beaches. I forget exactly how many beaches. There were multiple beaches. And most of them either were largely unopposed or went extremely well for the Allies. I think only 2 had significant opposition, and those are always the ones we see, like Saving Private Ryan, That particular beach scene, that one is like one of the ones that went really poorly. And like any World War II game that starts with DDay is always, of course, going to be, one of the beaches that went poorly because that's more exciting. But like 80% of the beaches, it it was pretty uneventful. Also, the roads weren't exactly equipped for tanks, and also the only real way to tow a tank is with another tank, and if you're bogged down, like it's there's not a whole lot to do. So, Ally after D-Day, the Allies were able to set up airfields in France. Um, were able to start hitting. Were able to start bombing German. Bleh, able to start bombing German targets, particularly fuel reserves, munition plants, other important targets. Um, they even hit Berlin, killing 3,000 civilians, but the Germans would not surrender. So a number of Allied air commanders wanted to bring the war to the German people, as the Germans had done in London. So February 13th, 1945, 2.6, no, sorry, 2,600 tons of incendiary bombs were dropped on Dresden by British planes. And the next morning, another 2,000 tons fell from American bombers. Now, incendiary bombs basically means they're using bombs with what's the word, Otto? Uh, the jelly. Uh, what flamethrowers use? Napalm, napalm bombs. 25,000 between 25,000 and 40,000 people died. Many of them were actually refugees fleeing the Soviets. Survivors recounted gruesome details. The firebombing of Dresden is known as one of the truly. This actually got an entire page. Uh, One of the truly horrible events of the war. Uh, do, 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 do. For some of, here we go. Let's see. Eyewitnesses reported horrific scenes of streetcars passing by full of people on fire, of water reservoirs packed with people who had died of asphyxiation. From some of the debris poked arms, heads, legs, and shattered skulls. The static water tanks were filled up to the top with dead human beings, some with large pieces of masonry lying on top of that again. Most people looked as if they'd been inflated with large yellow and brown stains on their bodies, people whose clothes were still glowing. So yeah, not a not a great event for the group that was supposed to be the good guys. So there's Dresden. So, now the Battle of Berlin. After the Battle of Kursk, Soviet forces were marching west into the German territory. Um, they did stop near Warsaw in mid-July. Use words to allow the Polish Home Army to be destroyed by the Germans before continuing on, because why would you help out the Polish? Um, April 28th, Mussolini was captured and hanged by Italian partisans. Hitler shot himself in his bunker on April 30th, knowing what Soviets would do if they captured him. Yeah, if the Soviets captured him, it would have been probably something we couldn't print in the book. May 8th, the Third Reich finally capitulated, agreeing to the unconditional surrender dictated by the Allies. which was largely due to the Soviets because they were the only ones actually in Berlin. Um, by the time of the surrender, the Soviets had most of Eastern Europe under their control. The Allies had freed France, Western Germany, part of Austria, and Greece. Tito had, as we had said, freed Yugoslavia rather than getting the Soviets' help. So Yugoslavia was not part of the USSR, despite it being communist, but it wasn't backed by the Soviet USSR. So there's some of the remains of Berlin. There's the famous picture of the soldier putting up the Soviet flag on the Reichstag. Alright, I need to actually have this. Let's, okay. Now, back to the Pacific. There was jungle fighting in the Philippines and Burma. Japanese simply refused to surrender on Okinawa and Iwo Jima. That was some of the hardest fighting. Call of Duty World at War, which is relatively old now. It's a pretty good game because you're able to play, because in Europe you play as a Russian soldier, and then for the American soldier you play in the Pacific. So you're able actually to see both fronts of the war, but you actually get to play as a Russian soldier. So you get to see Stalingrad, and you play through until the Battle of Berlin, and you actually end up being, you end up being that guy. You're literally that dude that puts the flag up on the Reichstag. So it's pretty neat. It's one of the few Call of Duty games I've truly enjoyed. What were we doing? Oh, so they estimated that they were to try to invade Japan, it would cost hundreds of thousands of lives, not to mention the civilians. They did firebomb Tokyo, and that was the firebombing of Tokyo cost more lives than both of the atomic bombs combined. Um, the firebombing was so intense, like people would jump into ditches full of water to get away from the firebombs, and they would just be boiled alive. Um, if they managed to get to bomb shelters, they would just asphyxiate or bake because the heat was so intense. It would just suck the air out of the shelters, or just heat the area up so much that the shelters wouldn't be able to save them. So it was really awful. And again, to mention a piece of fiction, Shin Godzilla, which is my favorite Godzilla, 2016. Um, there's a scene that directly references the firebombing of Tokyo, and it's pretty powerful. Now, as we mentioned, there were the two atomic bombs, and there was also a declaration of war from the Soviet Union, which had before this point been neutral to Japan. I actually wrote a lot on that as well, on August 8th, as well as the invasion of Manchuria, led the civilian government with the urging of Emperor Hirohito to accept the surrender of Japan, because Hirohito had kind of been pushing for the surrender, but the military was in charge of the government at this point. It was a whole weird thing. So there's either Iwo Jima or Okinawa. I don't know which one it is. It's the islands are all just these awful hellscapes. So, okay, got to get through these last few in the last 15 minutes. Oh, we got time. Um, So, as early as November 1943, after Kursk, the Big Three, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, met in Iran, which I know seems weird today, but that was a good neutral area. Discussions ranged from where to open the Second Front, whether to help Tito's partisans, and what to do after the war. Um, Stalin was just like, hey, let's just grab 50,000 random Germans and shoot them as collective punishment. And I feel like Roosevelt and Churchill were like, maybe not do that. Uh, February 1945, there was the Yalta Conference. Stalin agreed to join the United Nations, which was created at the beginning of 45. This replaced the League of Nations. But pretty early on, he was already showing quite what a monster he was as he was executing Polish officers who fought the Nazis and 10,000 Russian soldiers who served in Europe because he felt like they had been corrupted by capitalism by just being in Europe. It's weird. Um, Near Berlin, there was the Potsdam Conference between July and August. Um, Truman sat in for Roosevelt, who had recently died. Uh, the Soviets kept much of the land they had won. The Poles were given the Polish corridor in Germany, so they got a little bit of land. So there's the big three. Yeah, Roosevelt, I mean, I guess isn't in as bad shape as he was in. Smoking wouldn't have made things too much worse. Now, that's definitely not Churchill, but I don't think that was the guy that replaced him. I think that might be the head of France. I'm not sure. It might be the guy that replaced him. Because I know he was replaced near the end of the war, and like he was just like in a meeting, and this guy walked up to him and was like, "Hey, you've been replaced," and he was so pissed. So it took a while to deal with everything that happened during the war, especially with the concentration camps that they had discovered. There were the Nuremberg Trials. 24 high-ranking Nazi officials were tried. Two were acquitted. 12 sentenced to death. 200,000 were arrested. 5,000 were accused of war crimes, and about 600 were executed. Of course, within the USSR, there were lots of summary executions, but it was mostly for just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They weren't too much worried about death camps. Um, Partisans and resistance groups lynched Germans, collaborators, and women accused of consorting with Nazi officers because, partisans and resistance groups do whatever they want. So here we have the Nuremberg Trials. You've got the UN guard there in the back. So, Western Europe suffered a lot, but Eastern Europe was really absolutely decimated. Millions of people were displaced, homes were completely destroyed. I mean, like, towns were wiped out to such an extent that they were completely deserted. There was nothing left. 70 million people died, 6 million Jews at the hands of the Nazis. Yes, here we go. This was what I'd had before. Gypsies, Slavs, homosexuals, and basically any other unclean groups of people were targeted, um, but they tend to be lesser known stories. Uh, the destruction of entire ways of life, homes, factories, schools, churches, basically everything uh, that civilization built itself on left deep scars, especially in the East, as the Cold War made it set itself in. So here we have the divide between the East and the West. Um, so, despite Spain being just cool with Germany at the time, uh, Ireland actually didn't join with NATO because they didn't want to have anything to do with the UK because they don't care. It's this typical Ireland. Um, Switzerland didn't either because Switzerland's just always neutral. Anyway, so blue here we have NATO. Um, red here the Warsaw Pact. East Germany is under USSR control, and then West Germany is here in with NATO. Now I'm not sure of what the status of Austria was. I mean, obviously here it's shown as not being part of NATO. I don't know what that means as far as the whole West versus East thing. Yugoslavia obviously doing its own thing. Um, I'm not sure. Jesus, louder than I meant for it to be. That was louder than I meant for it to be. Sorry. Anyway, um, let me turn that down for my next class. Wow. But yeah, so that's all I've got. A little bit early so I can go get me a little bit of food. Um, yeah, and then the Cold War happens, and the Cold War is a thing. Also, just real quick, I found this picture. I was starting class one day at my last college, and the last one I taught at, and I noticed that there was something in the recycle bin. And for some reason, I was like, I'm gonna check and see what that is because that wasn't often something that happened. They usually emptied it, I guess. And I checked, and it was this picture. I was like, I'm gonna take that. So I took it, and I put the sound behind it, and I put it at the end of this PowerPoint. It wasn't supposed to be that loud. Maybe it was just loud for me because these headphones are super fucking loud. But yeah. So that'll do it for this. Actually, this is the end of the chapter. Um, and yeah, I the end of the semester actually. So I'll put the final exam up on Blackboard next Wednesday because that's when the exams start. Um, let me see. Not you. Calendar. Okay, exams. April 29th through May 5th. Hold on. Let me back this up. May. Final grades are due by noon on May 6th. So, all right. So I'll put this up on Wednesday. You guys have to have it back to me by the 5th. If it's not back by the 5th, I can't accept it because I have to have it graded by I have to have it graded and put into your final grades by the 6th. So please do that. Test 3 and paper 2 are due by next Monday. Where's my thing? What's today? The 23rd. So by the 27th, it's technically the last day of class. So even though it's not our last day of class, I'm just going to push it to that date. So, give you guys as much time as we can. The 28th is reading day. So, yeah, university administrations will remain open. Now, normally, like I said, that'll be a time when you guys can come in and ask questions, but obviously we're not doing that. I'm going to try and get up that day and be here, either here on the YouTube, doing something, or I might be grading, and at least at the very least, I'll have my email up. And if you guys have any questions, just, email me, and I'll try and get back to you, like, immediately, about all of that. So, yeah, that's all I've got. I know nobody's in here because it says one person's watching, and it should say two's watching because I've got my stream up. So yeah, I'll see you guys. I guess Tuesday if you show up. Yeah, have a good weekend, and hope to see papers and tests by Monday, because I gotta have them. Okay, bye.